And you all have the handouts that I've given you, that beautiful image of William Blake's, the poet, the boy who's walking along, playing his flute. One of the main points that I'm going to be making today is about the marginalizing of certain characters in the Ballad of Master Manole. I had read an article not too long ago by a woman whose first name is Olga, and the rest of her name is unpronounceable to me, so I'll refer to her as Olga without intending any disrespect, but in which she talks about the marginalizing of the figure of Anna in the Manole legend, which is certainly true, that the emphasis is on Manole, and Anna herself is deprived of agency. She's oppressed by this dominating male, and so on. And it occurred to me that the other figure who is marginalized in analyses of the ballad is the little shepherd boy who's playing a flute. And I suppose, that's the main idea, what I'm mostly going to be talking about today. I think if there's anything that you'll take away from this talk, is the idea that although the central action of the poem, of the ballad then, has to do with the relationship between sacrifice and artistic creativity, which is the basis of the analysis that Mircea Eliade makes of the poem, that the ballad itself, the foundation of the ballad, comes from the artistic quality of it, the aesthetic quality of it, comes from the music which is played by the shepherd. So of course the entire ballad is in the form of rhymed couplets, and couplets that are moving back and forth, back and forth. So while our attention is on this monastery which is going up and up and up, the word alta is used a number of times. What I find so, the fascination of Romania to begin with, which came to me rather late in life, but also the Romanian language and this jos and sus that you have, and it took me a while as my wife and I are driving around, and we come to these villages where part of it was jos and part was sus. No, but the sus is up there and the jos is down here. But I think it's a very interesting point to make, that there's no, in a ballad in which Eliade is quite right, and this woman Olga is quite right in denouncing the oppression of women in the poem, and the disparity, the hierarchy between men up here and women down here, to remember that, okay, so it's sus up here and jos down here, that there's no hierarchy, no hierarchical oppression, to be sure, between the two. And also they almost rhyme, jos and sus, and so they're on a level of equality as well. And perhaps I'll jump to this point right away. My own formation was actually in math and physics. I was going to be a physicist, and I was very, very much into mathematics. Was my favorite subject until I heard Bob Dylan sing "Blowing in the Wind" in my hometown when I was 18 years old. The geometry and algebra were my favorite subjects. And I look at this poem very much in terms of the geometrical configuration, the back and forth, the left and right, but also the algebraic axes of x and y. So you have the y axis of up and down, of sus and jos, also of the dominating man, the submissive woman. But you also have throughout the poem the x-axis of the rhymed couplets. Okay, that's the final point that I was going to make. I'll get back to the beginning now. How do I happen to be here as an American talking about the legend of Master Manole, which I didn't know it from Adam, as we say. It was thanks to Gabi Balada. Several years ago, I was doing work, I was giving a talk in French, I guess, on René Girard. And I wanted to take into account, because I had done a lot of work on sacrificial rituals, on scapegoating rituals via René Girard. And I wanted to take into account Romanian responses to René Girard, of which I found very few. So somehow I got into contact with Gabi Balada, who said, yes, it is rather strange because Mircea Eliade did this commentaire the Manole legend. And I'm thinking, what in God's name is the Manole legend? And the next day I saw a friend of mine, a young student at the university. I said to her, Romanian, I said to her, have you ever heard of something called the Manole legend? And she laughed at me and said, we had to study it in school. We had to memorize it or whatever. That was very, very much a part of the curriculum in Romanian education. And that's the point that Olga makes, and was used very, very much in an oppressive way in reinforcing the sort of stereotype of the dominant husband, the submissive wife, and so on from there. And that I was so completely unaware of. So I guess what I'm saying is that I came to the legend very innocently as an American who was in Catholic school for 17 years and underwent a certain kind of indoctrination in that period, but it had nothing to do with the Manole legend. And what I saw it exclusively in terms of Eliade's interpretation, in which what he says is that it's an expression of an archaic building ritual, which I'd never heard of before. I knew a lot about scapegoating rituals, but building rituals I knew nothing of at all. And what I saw and what I found fascinating, and some of you know the book that I wrote then, called The Seance of Reading. It was published a couple of years ago here in Bucharest, dealing with, say, the disguised return of archaic building rituals in literary works, in masterpieces of modernist writing. The Great Gatsby is the best example, because there you have a novel in which Gatsby plays the role of Anna, as it were, that Fitzgerald is determined that Gatsby's going to get killed in that novel so that he can bury him, he can immure him, as it were, in this novel, which will stand as one of the great classics of American literature. And so in that book, the introductory chapter was entitled The Manole Complex. It was the idea then that, kind of imitating Freud's idea of the Oedipus complex, that there's something hidden beneath the surface. In this book, it was the idea that it's not the desire to kill the father, to sleep with the mother, as in the Oedipus complex, but rather it was this desire to, or the obligation, as it were, the imperative, if one wants to create something enduring, that there has to be a sacrifice. And it's certainly a controversial aspect of Eliade, and I recognized it myself as a controversial aspect of Eliade's interpretation, even without reading Olga's book. The idea that the Manole legend is central to the experience of the Romanian people. It's the Romanian people in particular who have this guiding belief, as it were, in the importance and the necessity of sacrifice in order to create a lasting achievement. Okay, the new book that I have and I've passed out, and I give it different titles, but for the moment and in terms of the talk that I'm giving today, I'm calling it Balancing All the Bilateral Imperative of Writing. And what I realized, I guess the beginning, so the introductory chapter is going to be called The Manole Complexes, as I indicated. I'm going to be using Vasile Alexandri's writing then of the legend as the basis of my introduction. And what it is that when I wrote the earlier book, all I knew about the legend, which I had not really read in detail, and I've read it in extensive detail, as you'll see, and I've made many marginal notes on it, that what I basically knew about it is what Eliade had said, and seeing it very much in terms of an archaic building ritual. What I realized, and the excitement that I felt, and that I hope to share with you, is I didn't realize until I looked very, very closely, and with Google Translate, going through the original Romanian, is that there is a very small detail, which I wasn't aware of it. I don't think that Eliade mentions it, but the prince says to Manole and his men, if those walls keep collapsing, I'm going to bury you in the walls of the monastery that you're building. And it's it's that night, I guess it is, that Manole has the dream. And in the dream, it's that they're not going to get killed. It's they're going to kill someone else. And it's going to be a woman. It's either going to be a wife or a sister. It's going to be someone who's not part of their community. So in other words, it's what's involved there is a scapegoating ritual, which I recognized right away. And even without the help of René Girard, I would have seen that it was a process, an event that involved the transfer of guilt, say, from a community to an individual, to a vulnerable individual. As with the building ritual, according to Eliade, it's what we see is the transfer of the spirit of a living person to an inanimate object, which is the monastery which is under construction. So you have in both cases, in this symmetry then, this balance, as it were, back and forth between one form of transfer of guilt to an individual, in the other of life to an inanimate building. And then I realized as well that the whole poem itself, and at one point, Eliade uses the word immolate. It's in French, but in translated into English, he says that the men immolate Anna. And I always thought immolate, that means you burn someone, but it doesn't. I looked it up. And in a more general way, it means to create a sacrifice. And what I realized is that while at the center of the action of the ballad, you have this immolation of a human person, of a woman in this particular case, the poem itself, it's not the immolation, it's the imitation of the human body, of the bilateral structure of the human body, left, right, above, below, inalt and sus. And it's a very interesting distinction because inalt suggests the idea of human ambition. It brings something which is not there in the word sus. So anyway, those are the liminal complexes will be the idea, and throughout as it turns out, and I didn't realize it when I began this project about 20 years ago, I thought there was only going to be one book on sacrificial ritual, and which there is, it's online. 2 years ago, when I was finishing the book on the building ritual, or the seance of reading, I was in the preface. I was saying this is the second and final volume of my work, and my wife said, "Don't say it's the final one. Don't say it's the final. Maybe another one will come along." And as it happened, there are 3 volumes. So one on sacrifice, and they're all related. It's all inspired by the Manole legend. On the one hand, you have sacrificial rituals in my book called Ritual Unbound. Then you have building rituals in the seance of reading, and now in the under construction, as it were, and who knows when, a book that will deal with the sometimes I call it the symmetrical imperative, sometimes the bilateral imperative. One of these days I will finally know it will be published under one of those forms. Okay, the other point that I wanted to make, speaking of titles then, is the alternate title that I have for this book. I think it's very clever, because I think it's clever, I'll probably hold on to it. It's called Bypassing the Plot. Bypassing the Plot, the title, and the subtitle, The Bilateral Ploy, the bilateral ploy of writing. And it's the idea then that, and ever going back to the Iliad, if you pause for a moment, you're familiar with the Iliad, the Trojan War, and so on. And if you have read the Iliad from beginning to end, you're always surprised. You think, oh, there must be another chapter. There must be something missing. Because, of course, in the Iliad, the Trojan War does not come to an end. The Iliad ends with the death of Hector, the burial, and so on. So the Iliad, and it sets, the Iliad is the foundational work. Everything in Western literature, at least, follows, whether consciously or unconsciously, follows the Iliad in this idea of not reaching a conclusion, of bypassing the plot. Aristotle says we have to have a plot, beginning, middle, and end. But great writers say no. Instead of having a conclusion, they have they replace conclusion with congruence, with a balance between left and right. Trust me, believe me, that the Iliad, the whole poem is written in the form of a chiasm. And book 1, or book 24, say, of the Iliad is the mirror image of book 1. If you want, you can go back tonight. You don't have to read the whole Iliad. You can just look at book 1 and book 24, and you'll see, if you're really paying attention, and if you notice you're not being concerned with the plot, but rather this bilateral ploy, the way that Homer is creating a sense of completion. A sense of completion, not by reaching a conclusion, but by creating these left-right congruences. Okay, I really had so much fun going through and learning all these Romanian words and then forgetting them and learning them again. But I was looking in the poem to see, I wanted to see evidence that the Manole legend is a rewriting of the Iliad in the sense that, in this very specific sense of not reaching a conclusion, but rather creating a congruence. And I was looking at the English translation of this very lovely Romanian woman who's put it up on the internet, so I downloaded it. And she says, hello, my name is such and such, and I'm not really a scholar, but I really love the Manole legend. My English isn't perfect, but I'm going to translate it anyway. And so I'm looking at her translation, and I'm thinking, if the building of the monastery is going to come to a conclusion, the monastery, it's not simply being built so it'll be there. It's being built, it will serve some purpose. So of course it does serve a purpose. You bury your kings there, you bury your royalty in the monastery of Crăciunaș. But maybe there'll be some public ceremony. So the prince arrives, and maybe there'll be a public ceremony or what. But no, it's in the translation, it says, the prince arrives to pray. And I said, ruga, I knew that word, ruga. So I looked back into the Romanian, looking for ruga, and didn't find it. But what is there is, how do you say it, inchin, something like that, I-N-C-H-I-N-E, inchin, is that correctly pronounced, right? And what word immediately precedes, in the preceding line, the word inchin, vine. So it's the rhyme, it's the congruence between, so there's the biological ploy, if you will, there's the way of finishing without finishing in terms of an action. So it's this relation back and forth between action, between people doing something and making, the making of an object. My father was a carpenter. I say that every now and again when I give talks, but I'm thinking in terms of construction, of building, where a building is created, and a carpenter. My father, right away, if he read this poem, he said the walls were collapsing. He said it's because the carpenters or the builders are incompetent to get a new builder to build a thing. But anyway, be that as it may. But that was my great discovery. I hope that you find it pleasurable as well to realize that the word ruga is not there, and that rather it's, again, construction replaces action as the soul, as it were, of the work. So basically then getting back to the main point, if on the one hand Eliade places the emphasis of what we would call the sacrificial instinct, in my own reading, what I'm calling attention to is the symmetrical instinct. And the idea then that there is a difference between the construction of the monastery, which is being undertaken by a particular group, and the construction of the poem, which is a popular ballad. Where does it come from? I mean, it's the Romanian people, but Romanian people who are they expressing the soul and the essence of the Romanian experience, or are they expressing something more universal than that? Okay, so that brings me then to, and I am going to try to pronounce her name. So it's Olga Bartosiewicz Nicolaev. I think she's Romanian, but she's in Warsaw or Krakow. She's somewhere in Poland. She said, "Sorry, I can't come to your talk, but I'm not in Bucharest." But she writes English beautifully, and I was fascinated by this essay, and it really is, and it's why I wrote to the museum to ask if I could come and give a talk. That suddenly to realize the role of the experience that Romanians have of this legend, in contrast to my experience as an American who has no idea whatsoever of the way in which this legend has been used. And so again, there are 2 points that she makes. First of all, that it had been used for decades as part of the indoctrination, let's say, of young Romanians, and indoctrinating in particular with respect to certain stereotypes of the hierarchical relationship as though we're a natural relationship between men and women. And then the second point of her essay, and I do recommend it, it's called the margins versus the center of the national literary canon, the margins versus the center. And by which she means, with the margins, it's the idea that after 1989, with the fall of Ceausescu and so on, you have all of these questionings or deconstructions, even she uses that word, these deconstructions of that received interpretation of the legend, and particularly on the part of feminist readers who challenge the distinction, again, the marginalizing, let's say, of Anna. Oh, okay, going on then, thinking in terms of this subject of marginalizing. By the way, I have not worn a watch ever since I retired from teaching about 12 years ago, but I did bring my Kindle along. Hold on just a second. My Kindle reader, it tells me it's 4:37 in the morning. I guess that means that it's 11:37 here. So I don't know how long I'm supposed to talk. I don't know how long you would like me to talk, whatever, but I'll go along, and there are many additional points that I could make, and perhaps I would like very much to turn my time over to discussion as well. What I was thinking about with the subject of marginalizing is, as I did mention right at the very beginning, that it's not only the figure of Anna who's marginalized, but also her unborn child. So I think it's really, and what I've noticed in Olga's essay, and it seems to me I've come upon a couple of other essays as well, that Anna is referred to as a woman, or as a wife, but she's not referred to as a pregnant woman. And what I see there, and without getting into, and I have noticed that because Olga mentions her very interesting, her bibliography, with dozens of entries that she has, where she refers to various, oftentimes, for the most part, women, but also, what's his name, the Romanian who lives in Andrei Crețulescu, something like that, has also been involved in this. But the idea that, again, over and over again, referring to Anna, but not taking into account the unborn child, and not to get into the whole subject of the right to abortion and so on. That what I find interesting is, again, with my symmetrical perspective in mind, and always ready to see parallels. Talk about this Igbo proverb, where one thing is standing, something else must be standing. Well, if the one thing that is standing most centrally in the Manole legend is the creation of the monastery, what stands next to it? Well, what stands next to it is procreation. So you have this relationship between biological creation and artistic creation, let's call it, so that it sets up, again, a symmetry, a bilateral symmetry between the two. So it's not simply, again, a relationship of domination and oppression, but also of a form of symmetry, which I guess is, for the most part, overlooked, is not, unlike, I should at some point mention, it's a painter, a Moldovan painter named Igor Vieru, who did this however many years ago. And it is the legend is called the Meșterului Manole. It was interesting. I showed this in Yash the other day. I had Alexandru Jan Pușa, whatever the name of the university. This was last spring, and students didn't immediately recognize it as referring to as an image of the Manole legend. And what I find fascinating about it, of course, it is bilateral. It's the symmetry between the two panels. He could very easily have made a diptych, or he could have made a series of panels in which he represents, and I'm sure there are comic books that illustrate panel by panel each of the episodes of the legend. But instead, he gets to the essence of it, to the congruence then between the death of Anna and the death of Manole. And what I find fascinating myself, again, is the way in which it's like fractals. Fractals, Benoit, I'm forgetting his last name, who created this idea of fractals, where you have a design, a form, on a very large scale, and that form is reflected on the level of smaller details as well. And so here you have the congruence of the two panels of the diptych, which is parallel to the congruence between the rhymed couplets throughout the poem, and then between these tiny details of the rhymed couplets and the big detail of the two deaths, you have all of these other in-between fractals, as it were, that have a similar form. Oh, and actually, I had made this point before, but I will repeat it because I do think it's important, is that the shepherd who's playing the flute, and I don't know if this guy's a shepherd or not, but he is playing a flute, so I'm going to use him as my example. And I just love the idea that he is, in the poem, he is so marginalized, though, so what is, how do you pronounce it? Chabonis, is that close? You recognize it, more or less, yeah, the word for shepherd. And he's playing a fluere, whatever, a flute, that's a duenas or something. It's it ends in AS, so it's, again, the idea that it's the musicality of the shepherd. And also remember, the shepherd is taking his flock up and down the Ages. So you have the sus and jos again. And it's not oppressive at all. It's a natural movement, which then becomes very exploitative on the the human level, once men get together, or once any group gets together. You know, since I mentioned a group, I think it's interesting to notice also another kind of bilateral symmetry in that ballad has to do with the power relationship between a single person and a group. And you think, well, right away, what you see, I imagine, it's up to you what you see right away. What I see right away is the relationship between Manole and his men and Anna. So you have a group of men, there are 10 of them, remember, and she's a single person, and they exert this power over her in immuring her in the building. But notice then the way in which that's balanced with the power that the prince exerts over Manole and his men, which again is a single person exerting power, oppressing a group of 10. So you have this strange, this reversal, this inversion. Remember too, another kind of symmetry. The prince says at the beginning, if you build this monastery, I will make you illustrious people, I will elevate you. And then what happens at the end of it, well, they are elevated. They're up on the roof of the monastery. And he says to them, but if you fail at the beginning, if you fail, I'll bury you in the foundation. And what happens, of course, is they fall from the elevation. This idea that on the level of the action, what happens at the end repeats something at the beginning, but repeats it in a surprising way. And that also is in parallel with the relationship throughout the entire poem, the relationship between the rhyming words. So there's a sound that comes back each time, but the sound comes back in a surprising way, in a new way, in the form then of the rhymed word. The other thing, I don't know how much to make of this. You know, the inspiration, in a way, for the kind of analysis that I've been doing for a long time. There's a book by Aldous Huxley called The Doors of Perception. You know the Doors, you know Jim Morrison, right? That's right, Jim. Well, that's where the Doors got their name from, and don't tell me it isn't, because I was out in California in the 1960s, and I know that's where the Doors got their name. The Doors of Perception is a fascinating work. Do you know the name Aldous Huxley? Huxley. Aldous Huxley, The Doors of Perception. It's your homework assignment, you've heard it, and the rest of you, is he's British, but he's out in California, I guess it is a long time ago, and he's taking mescaline. And he talks about the effects of mescaline. And one of the principal effects is that things that seem very, very important lose their importance. And things that seem secondary acquire an importance, that we begin perceiving things that we would never have noticed before. I'm suddenly noticing, I'm not on this, but noticing the doors back here. They're in the form of a kind of triptych, aren't they? There's the door. It's beautifully done. It could not have been more perfectly arranged. Look at it, the door is there in the middle, and there are two immovable panels on either side. And you could spend a lot of time walking back and forth through that door. And all you notice is that it opens and closes. You notice the usefulness of it. But it's then the useless aspect of what we see there that emerges. And so with or without the use of mescaline, that was a long time ago, what I do is in the course of my analysis, when I start noticing these bilateral forms, I find them everywhere. And that's leading up to, and I hesitated with this one, but Anna is suffocating, you remember, and she talks about, she says, I can't breathe, the walls are pressing in on me. And I just wonder, with the shepherd who's there with his flute and his respiration, for what it's worth, the respiration, the free breathing of the shepherd, in contrast then, or in parallel with the suffocation of Anna, perhaps is something worth thinking about. Also her cries, and what I had noticed before is she does cry out a number of times. And how does Manole respond? He doesn't. It's perfectly silent. So you have to hear her cries back and forth with his non-response, his silence. And then also to think perhaps of her cries. And I think she says something about her baby's cries as well, which is an unrealistic detail, I suppose. But you have her cries, and then in contrast to that, the very little is made of the shepherd himself. In contrast to her cries, you have the music that the shepherd is playing on his flute, and that the creators of the ballad have transposed to rhyme throughout the entirety of the ballad. Is this interesting? Hope so. Again, tell me I'm wrong for thinking this is so. I find it really fascinating. You have the walls of the monastery that are going up during the day, and they're collapsing at night. And that's a very unfortunate occurrence, right? The going up and going down. But in the poem, going up the Argus, going down the Argus, going back and forth, and so on, the reciprocity of, on the one hand, on the other hand, is contrasted with, there is no reciprocity at all between building of the walls and the collapsing of the walls. There's a wonderful phrase in Fernando Pessoa's The Book of Disquiet, where he says that anything and everything can be either an obstacle or a miracle. And I think of that a lot. And in relation to the Manole legend, the collapsing of the walls, which is certainly an obstacle, is contrasted with the back and forth, the up and down on other levels, on the level again of the movement of the shepherd with his flock. And that's the other thing. Remember that you have Manole and his men, the prince and the builders, including Manole, and also the shepherd with his flock. So you have three different relationships of control, I suppose, where Manole is the foreman of the group, he's the master builder, the prince lords it over the men, and then the shepherd has this, I suppose, a more natural relationship, and also the flute that he plays, presumably a pan flute, it's made from reeds rather than being made from bricks and requiring labor and so on. I'm immensely impressed by the control that Romanian shepherds have over their sheep. When we're driving along and we see these hundreds of sheep coming at us, think, oh my God, we're going to be here for hours. But no, like that, the sheep, somehow it happens, magically move over. And there's nothing oppressive about it, and the sheep certainly don't object at all. The other thing, and I'll be kind of moving to an end with this, Beckett has a wonderful line, for to end yet again, pour finir encore. And so I'll finish once, I'm not sure how many times I'll finish, but one of the one of the, as I've said throughout, is I find it so interesting to think of the poem in terms of a y-axis, domination, submission, and an x-axis of equality. And one of the most, for me, one of the most interesting moments, and it happens a couple of times, is Manole, or the men say, I guess it's Manole who says, maybe it's the men, who says that whenever one of the women, whether it's a, I have to look at this for a moment, I don't see the words, it's the Romanian words for sister and wife, so it's soțiora, sodiora, whatever. It's just the change of one letter, right? The R and the T, so they sound very, very similar. And what I find fascinating in terms of this intersection of the y-axis and the x-axis is that it's men dominating women, to be sure, but at that very moment where the role of domination is most apparent, also the symmetrical imperative comes into play. So of the sacrificial line on the y-axis, the symmetrical on the x-axis, so it's soțiora, closely, and sodiora, back and forth, like that. Oh yeah, I have it here. And again, not very sure how much I would make of this, but I cannot resist the temptation of pointing out that in the poem, especially because the lines, they're so tiny. I mean, they're only about like 4 syllables maybe to each line. And the rhyme words, you see them right away. That one rhyme word is above the other rhyme word. But when you hear it read, and I'm not going to read it to you, believe me, if you did hear it read, you would hear one word over here to the left, the other over to the right. So again, it's the horizontal line competing or intersecting with the vertical line. Okay, I am coming up. There will be 2 conclusions, because I went to the trouble of going over to the strada academia, whatever it is, to have some copies made. And I was like, can they do it in color? Yes, they could do it in color. I was very, very happy with that. But I want to, before, and I will read the Blake poem to you because it's in English, and I'll be very pleased to do it. I hope that will be a pleasure for you as well. To conclude my prepared remarks with the idea or the question of the perfection of the Romanian ballad, of the Romanian version of a building ritual, which is what the Manole legend is. Okay, in Eliade's Commentaire sur la Légende de Manole, he says that, as I pointed out at the beginning, perhaps as you know, that it has to do with the expression of the Romanian experience, the importance of sacrifice, the readiness of women to make sacrifices. By the way, just to jump back for a moment, realizing and there was a whole lot of rain the other day. I mean, the cab driver told me the city closed down because of the rain. There's a lot of rain in Manole. Remember the rain? But what's interesting, there are 2 things in terms of symmetries again. It's not only that it rains a lot, as Anna is coming with lunch or dinner, whatever it is, from Manole, but also wind. So you have the balancing. The rain comes, that doesn't stop her. The wind comes, that doesn't stop her. You can say, oh, well, it's Romanian womanhood, right? The Romanian women, they're just like that. They don't let anything get them down. Or you don't have to say that, though, that they're willing to make these sacrifices. You can say, no. What's interesting is the symmetry between this impersonal force, the wind or the rain, trying to prevent resisting her advance, And this person, whether a man or a woman, or whether Romanian or a Martian, resisting the resistance, as it were. And also, I mean, it is important that there not just be one natural element that's resisting her arrival, but that there be two, the rain on the one hand, the wind on the other. And I remember myself, the first time I read the commentary by Eliade, and he's talking all about the Romanian women making sacrifices, even without Olga. I thought, I don't know, I mean, how do Romanian women feel about this? And now I know, at least a number of them do from reading her. But what I will end with in my prepared remarks is my favorite woman writer, who is Simone Weil. And I always have to point out, with my fingers, it's Simone Weil with a W, because there is also a Simone Weil with a V. And talk about a bilateral symmetry. They're both very, very estimable women in very, very different ways. But it's Simone Weil, the Jewish mystic then, in her book, it was published posthumously, La Pesanteur de la Grâce, Gravity and Grace. It's a nice symmetry. The English translation, the words work better. In French, it's La Pesanteur de la Grâce, but in English, it's Gravity and Grace, which are very, very nicely paired, P-A-I-R-E-D. In Gravity and Grace, then, she says that every work will have an author, because it is a human artifact. It will have an author. So it may indeed be, in this case, a Romanian author. But then she says, the more perfect the work, and kind of contra Eliade in a way, it's not the more perfect, the more perfectly it will express the soul of a people, of a nation, of a community. The more perfect the work, the more perfectly anonymous it will become. So so what begins as something personal will move in that upward direction of the impersonal. And she says finally it will, as it achieves perfection, it will imitate the anonymity. It will imitate the anonymity of divine art. So it's the contrast then between Eliade's idea, it imitates the soul of the Romanian people, willingness to make sacrifices and so on, with the imitation of divine art. What is the epitome of divine art? I was about to say, of course, and I realized I have to restrain myself, because sometimes I'll say, of course, and I was, maybe it's not all that obvious, but the epitome of divine art is the human body, with its bilateral structure of left, right, above, below, behind is back there, behind and before. And by the way, just really quickly, to realize in the Genesis account of creation, how many days of creation are there? Well, there are 6 days. Why are there 6 days of creation? Well, because there's a left, a right, above. How many is that? There are 6. 6, count them. So in other words, it's not that God has told the Hebrew people, this is how I created the universe, but rather it's the community then, thousands of years ago, that projected the bilateral structure of the human body onto the creation of the universe. And that's why I think, again, and with this idea of the Manole complex and now the Manole complexes, for the longest time in the period of gestation, a long time ago, my project was called, the introduction was the Daedalus complex, because Daedalus is the great artist in Greek. And I really wanted to hold on to that because of the echo with Oedipus. I thought it was very interesting to have that echo, but then I was reluctant to give it up, but but realized that finally the Manole legend was in such compact form. It's just, you can read it in 10 minutes, but it has everything is there. That the basic structure of all great literary works, going from the Iliad. I was about to say to the Great Gatsby. I'm not sure the Great Gatsby is a great literary work, but in any event, I talk about it a lot because everyone knows it or thinks they know it, so I can offer a defamiliarization. Okay, so I'll conclude by calling to your attention, asking you can read along with me if you would like, is this, and this is Blake's own image, to be sure. He did the illustrations for the Book of Innocence and Book of Experience. And I love that the image, thinking of the Manole legend. So Manole, after the prince says, I'm going to kill all you guys, Manole falls asleep and he has a dream. But the dream is, once you see it, it is, of course, it is so obviously in the form of a scapegoating ritual. We're not the ones who are going to be punished. Someone else will be punished. And here, it's not the scapegoating impulse at all. It's this little child who's up there on a cloud and who's inspiring the flute player as he's piping along, inspiring him to, and going through successive stages. Just notice that before I start reading it, the poem itself follows the successive stages of writing. So it is its own Manole legend, as it were, but in a very innocent way, that it's not sacrifice at all. It's not the sacrificial imperative or the sacrificial instinct so much as it is the musical instinct, the instinct that leads us to sing, to dance. Remember with Greek tragedy, at the center of tragedy is a sacrifice, right? The sacrifice of Oedipus. But long before there was Greek tragedy, that was a specific historical moment, the 5th century BC. Before that, for how long? Don't ask me, I don't know. But there were choruses that were singing and dancing. And they would dance in one direction, then they would dance in the other direction. They would dance their strophe, and then they would dance their antistrophe back and forth. And it was out of that musical origin that Greek tragedy found its source. Okay, so this is the introduction to songs of innocence, songs of experience. Songs of experience, things become much more complicated, much more dire in a way. But here it is. And kind of get a sense, I guess, as I'm reading, that the simplicity of the rhyme scheme, of the poetic form, is something like the simplicity of the Manole legend. But at the very end, he says he's going to write a poem that every child may joy to hear. Well, that's not the Manole legend by any means. And I've been the experience of Romanian friends and mothers who said, my little girl, when she heard about this poem and so on, the Manole legend was quite horrified. Piping down the valleys wild, piping songs of pleasant glee, on a cloud I saw a child, and he laughing said to me, pipe a song about a lamb. So I piped the merry cheer. Piper, pipe that song again. So I piped, he wept to hear. Drop thy pipe, thy happy pipe, sing thy songs of happy cheer. So I sung the same again, while he wept with joy to hear. Piper, sit thee down and write in a book that all may read. So he vanished from my sight, and I plucked a hollow reed. And I made a rural pen, and I stained the water clear, and I wrote my happy songs, every child may joy to hear. I suddenly remembered, you know the American poet Allen Ginsberg. Do you? Right, yeah. You should go on Google, on YouTube, Allen Ginsberg, William Blake. and just listen. He chants. Ginsberg, he just loved Blake, and he's the perfect reader for the Blake poems. But just notice in the third line of the first stanza, on a cloud I saw a child. Well, why is the child up on a cloud? Because it rhymes with child. So this is wonderful, back and forth, this merging of, in a very, very lovely way. Okay, thank you.